To be.
All right. So we're starting chapter 9.
Wow.
Quadratic equations.
So 4.
Okay. Quad means 4. But if you look up on the pink sheet over there, the difference in a quadratic compared to a linear is in the quadratic, there's going to be an x squared in it. Okay? So we've just been doing a linear. Linear equations don't have any exponents in it. A quadratic, if we were to graph it, if the x squared is positive, it's going to be a parabola. This is what this is called, that opens up. If the x squared is negative, it's going to be a parabola that opens down. Okay? So before we do this, though, we're going to be doing solving quadratic equations, the easy ones. All right. Positive square root, negative square root. Remember, this sign isn't called a square root sign. Do you remember what it's actually called?
No. What's it called?
It's called a radical sign.
Is it a radical sign?
It's a radical sign. The only reason they call it a square root is because...
It's square root 6.
Right. Square root of 4 is 2. You also have cubed roots. Cube root of 8 is 2. You also have fourth roots. The fourth root of 16 is 2. A cubed root means what do you multiply 3 times to get this number? 2 times 2 times 2. Fourth root, what do you multiply 4 times? 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. The only reason they call this a square root is because this is a 2 there. It's just since it's the first one, they just leave it blank and then it's assumed that everyone knows it's a square root. Okay? But the sign is actually a radical sign. Now, if you got a calculator, if you tried this, you know what the square root of 16 is, right? 4. Square root of negative 16. Anyone know what that is?
Negative 4.
Check it.
Would be a positive. This would be 2.
Okay, if it was positive 4, remember, square root means what can you multiply times itself to get that? 4 times 4 is not negative 16.
Negative 4 times negative 4.
Negative 4 times negative 4 is what? Positive 16.
Negative 4 times.
Negative 4 times negative 4.
Negative 4 times positive 4, they're not the same number, so that's not a square root. It's got to be a number times itself to get that.
I have no idea.
8 times 8 is 64.
So what are we?
Trying to figure out what's the square root of negative 16.
There is none.
There isn't?
There is no solution. There is no number you can multiply times itself to get a negative. Did anyone try it on the calculator?
It says error.
Error.
Oh, I was supposed to.
Okay?
Really?
So you can never have a negative on the inside. Now when you get into algebra 2, they start dealing with imaginary numbers, which does involve, you can have negative square roots. They use the imaginary number I, and that has to do with
It says error.
error. That has to do with fractals, if you've ever heard of fractal art or anything like that. Well, anyway, we don't need to worry about that now. We can't solve anything if it's got a negative square root. When they say this like this, that just means the negative is on the outside. You can have a negative on the outside, you can't on the inside. Because if you figure this out, this is 4, and then the negative just stays there. Okay? Positive square root just means there's nothing in front. It's a positive. Okay? The radicand, I guess, is no big deal if you know what that is, unless you're on Jeopardy or something. But the number underneath is called the radicand. So 16 is the radicand, 4 is the radicand, 8 is. The perfect squares. Square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 9 is 3. You guys know how to figure out the perfect squares, right? What's the next perfect square? 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, and 100. Okay? irrational numbers. If you remember on the MCA test last year, they had a bunch of these on there. If you remember what they are, they're simple. The definition of an irrational number is a decimal that goes on forever without repeating. Because repeating decimals go on forever, but they repeat. Pi is the most common irrational number. Pi is irrational, and then every non-perfect square. Square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 4 is rational because it's just 2. Square root of 5, square root of 6, square root of 7, square root of 8, square root of 9 is rational. So the irrational numbers, the ones we deal with, are pi and all the square roots that are not perfect. Okay? Quadratic equation. It's up there on the board, in case you ever forget. A quadratic equation in standard form is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. All that means is you just put numbers in there. 3x squared minus 2x plus 1. A quadratic equation just has an x squared. It doesn't have to have an x because b could be 0. The only thing a quadratic has to have is an x squared. You could have y equals 2x squared. That's quadratic. Y equals negative 3x squared plus 1. That's quadratic. Or you could have all three of them. That's quadratic. If it's ever got an x squared, that's what makes it quadratic. The leading, do you remember what coefficients are?
Probably the what are we do?
Coefficient is a number in front of a letter. Okay? So if you had to guess in this one, what's the leading coefficient? 3. The leading coefficient here?
3.
Now, if they wrote this in a different, not in standard form, I'll just mix one up. Okay? This is called a constant. It doesn't have a variable. Here's a coefficient, here's a coefficient. Which one is the leading? Right, the one with the x squared is the leading one. Again, this is not that big of a deal if you don't remember what that is, but okay, so finding, evaluating, you know how to do these on the calculator, use the square root. These are all perfect squares. Square root of 49 is 7, but there's a negative in front, so it's negative. That's just plain 7. What's that? Can't have a negative inside. Your calculator would show you an error. Square root of 0 is 0. Now we're getting into, we're going to evaluate b squared minus 4ac. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
No.
Okay. They tell us what a is, what b is, and what c is. This is, we're going to be doing this all the time. So you just plug the numbers in. B is 8 squared minus 4 times a times c. Now, when you do this on a calculator, yeah, it depends upon what kind you use. Like this one, you would put all of this in there first. 8 squared minus 4 times 7, then you make it negative, times 1, make it negative, press equals, and then you put the square root. You get 6. On these and your iPad calculators, I think, you got to put the square root sign in first, which is in yellow on the side here. So that means you got to hit the second function, square root. And then when this pops up, it looks like this. So what's going to happen is when you start typing numbers in, the square root, everything's going to stay under a square root until you put a parenthesis to show that you're done. Okay? So when we get to other problems, if you have the square root of 2 plus 5, if you typed it in just like this, if you press the square root button and then plus 2 and then go plus 5, you're going to get a wrong answer because it's going to put all of it under a square root. You've got to show that it's done with the square root, so you got to put a parenthesis there. You guys understand what I'm telling you? Okay. Here we don't need to worry about it because everything is going to be under the square root for today's stuff. But eventually it's going to be where it's going to end. Now, simple to do with a calculator. The one thing you got to watch for is right here. If b is ever a negative number, it's very easy, depending on what calculator you have, to get a wrong answer. Let's see if they give us an example. Here. You guys all have a calculator on the iPad? Try this just to see what you get. We're plugging them in here. So it's negative 3 squared minus 4 times a times c. I'm going to try both calculators and see what the only reason this could mess you up is because the b is a negative. It should be 5. You got 5 on your iPad calculator?
Phone. My iPad's dead.
Oh, on your phone calculator?
Yeah.
Okay, this one gives me 2.64575111, which is not correct.
So iPad.
Well, there's just one thing you need to realize on this. Right here.
So do that first.
When you put in a negative 3 and you square it, what's it going to turn to?
Decimal.
No. If you put negative 3 in here, what's negative 3 squared? Positive 9, right? Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9?
Yeah.
If you punch it in just like this in the calculator, this one follows the rules like we just learned. It only squares the 3 and it keeps that negative. You know what I mean? When I use these small calculators, if I put in negative 3 squared, it does give me 9. I don't need to put parentheses. So, there's one of two things you can do. You need to recognize that if you're using these calculators, and you got to put a parenthesis around that, which really gets confusing because when you hit the button, it starts like that. And since you got a negative, you'd have to put another parenthesis, negative 3, parenthesis, x squared, minus 4 times 2 times negative 2. And then you got to put another parenthesis to show that it's done. Okay? That's the long way to do it. The easy thing is this. If everyone remembers this, this number right here is always going to be positive. Every single time, right? So if b is ever negative, just disregard that negative sign. Then when you know you'll get it right every time. Okay? So, I mean, if you can remember that, it makes it a lot easier. So, I'm just going to make one up. Let's say A is 5, B is negative 6, and C is 1. To figure out B squared minus 4AC, we plug negative 6 in there, and again, since it's negative, just disregard that, because it's going to turn positive when you square it anyway. Minus 4 times A times C, square rooted. And you get 16, which is 4. Okay? So that's all we're doing today. We're going to do the problems where you just find the square root. They don't have the signs here, but it says find the square roots. Oh, I should point out one thing too. When you do, and you notice it says find all the square roots. That's because if you square root this, it actually has two answers. Because 9 times 9 is 81. What else? Negative 9 times negative 9 is also 81. So every square root always has two answers. The way you can write that is just put plus minus 9. If you square root this, what do you get? No solution. Square root this, you get 11. So just put that, you could also get negative, plus or minus 11. You can square root decimals, that would be 0.7, and it's plus or minus. Okay. Yep.